Welcome everyone tonight to Workers' Rights in the COVID-19 Coronavirus Era, a six-part series sponsored by the Washington Labor Education and Research Center with support from the Washington Federation of State Employees, AFSCME Council 28, the Washington State Labor Council, and SEIU Local 925. Our Labor Center is part of South Seattle College. It is the practice of the Seattle colleges to begin each meeting with a land acknowledgement honoring the peoples upon whose lands our classrooms stand. Though tonight all of us are scattered across the internet, I invite you to join me in this land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the people, past, present, and future, of the Duwamish tribe, the Muckleshoot tribe, the Sammamish tribe, and other people of the Salish Sea, on whose traditional lands we study and work. Thank you. The Labor Center is a nonpartisan state-funded program of the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges. We are housed at South Seattle College. Our mission is to provide education and tools for empowerment to workers across the state. We traditionally have focused on the legal rights of workers and on labor history. This webinar grows out of our Know Your Rights at Work training series. As the public health crisis and the economic crisis of the pandemic has hit our community, working people across the state have urgent new questions about their rights. We've gathered for you experts who will try to answer those questions. The opinions and information expressed belong to the speakers, not the Labor Center, but we hope if you find anything valuable, you will share it with your coworkers, your family, and your neighbors. Tonight's meeting is open to the public. It will be recorded and available for replay and download after tonight. This is the third in our webinar series, and it will cover housing protections in the time of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. Tonight's guests are Peter Houck, staff attorney at the Housing Justice Project, who will speak about protections for renters. Joseph Jordan, managing attorney at the Northwest Justice Project, to speak about protections for homeowners. And Michele Thomas, policy director at the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance, to talk about the ongoing advocacy to strengthen the protections we have won and have yet to win. And we will indeed start with Peter Houck. Peter, would you like to introduce yourself and give us a little overview of protection for renters in the pandemic era?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me this evening. I'm Peter Houck. I'm a staff lawyer at the Housing Justice Project. Our office is focused on helping renters in King County by stopping evictions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what emergency protections there are during the shutdown. So, for a disclosure, everything I'm going to say is just general information. It's not legal advice for your unique situation, but I am going to have resources where you can get free legal advice at the end of the presentation. Okay, so first point I want to make is that each level of government, from the federal government down to local cities, has been trying to do something to help renters during the shutdown and during the public health emergency. So one way to think of it is that as a renter, you have several layers of protections. I'm going to focus on the state protections that you have, since that applies to everyone in Washington. But I think it's helpful to know that in addition to that, as a renter, most, not all renters are protected by federal law. That's the CARES Act. And that stops landlords from starting eviction cases if you don't pay the rent. As I'm going to talk about in a little more detail in a second, Governor Inslee has passed an emergency order. Think of it as an emergency law. Some call it an eviction moratorium that does something similar to the CARES Act. It stops landlords from evicting you if you haven't paid your rent. And then some cities in the Puget Sound area have passed their own emergency protections for renters. Some of them are more or less the same as the state and federal laws, but some of the protections are even stronger. For example, in Seattle, the emergency protections there are even more powerful. I'm going to focus on the state protection, but I'll have more information about the other laws at the end of the presentation. Okay, so Governor Inslee's eviction moratorium. Like I said, the main thing it does for renters, the main way it protects renters is by stopping landlords from evicting renters if they can't pay the rent. The moratorium's really broad, as I'll explain. It applies to everyone in Washington who doesn't own their own housing and who's paying some kind of rent for the place where they live. So that's a lot broader than the federal law, the CARES Act, that only applies to some rental housing, and it's a lot broader than city laws that applies to only the people who live in that city. Another important thing to know about the moratorium is right now it goes from now to June 4th. So it lasts for the next 6 weeks or so. Like I said, the protection of the moratorium of the state law is really wide. So obviously it applies to people who live in an apartment, but it also applies to anyone who rents their housing. So that includes if you own a mobile home or an RV or something similar to that, and you rent space in a mobile home park, you're protected. The park owner can't evict you if you don't pay rent while the moratorium is in place. If you live in a hotel or motel and you've been living there for a while, like more than a month, you're protected. If you're renting a room for roommates, let's say you're not on the lease with the landlord, but you have some kind of deal with your roommate, maybe you're subleasing, you're protected. If you live in public housing, you're protected by the moratorium. If you're living in a short-term rental, something like an Airbnb, you're protected. So the scope of the protection is really wide. So what does this protection do? How does it help you? Between now and June 4th, your landlord can't evict you for unpaid rent or utilities. So if you can't pay the bills between now and early June, your landlord can't force you to leave. More specifically, your landlord can't give you a pay rent or pay the utilities notice. Well, what do I mean by that? As you might or might not know, before a landlord can evict someone, the landlord has to go to court. But before the landlord can go to court, they have to give the tenant a notice that says basically pay or leave in 2 weeks. The moratorium says the landlords can't give that notice if you don't pay. So that means that the landlords can't even start the eviction process. So that stops the process from even starting. If somehow the landlord were able to get around giving the notice, the moratorium also says that landlords can't go to court and have a hearing and ask a judge to tell the sheriff to evict you. And if the landlord somehow got around that prohibition, the moratorium also says that the sheriff, and that's the person who actually does the eviction and changes the locks, can't do any evictions because of unpaid rent. So the moratorium is really strong because it protects you at each one of these steps in the eviction process. So like I said, the moratorium goes from now until June 4th, and then it's set to lift. Governor Inslee has extended it once already. It's possible that he's going to extend it again. I think that's going to depend on what happens between now and early June. But right now, the moratorium will end June 4th. So what do you do then? An important thing to know is that the moratorium doesn't mean that you don't have to pay rent on June 5th. In other words, the moratorium hasn't canceled rent. So if you can't pay between now and June, you're going to still owe a couple months of rent with the landlord. So how do you deal with that? To be honest, I think the moratorium was written quickly because we're all in emergency, so it's a little unclear. But the lawyers that I work with, our best understanding of it is that in early June, starting on June 5th, if you owe a couple months of rent because you haven't been able to pay for the past couple months, the landlord can evict you for that overdue rent unless the landlord first gives you a payment plan. And it can't be any just payment plan, like pay me in a week or something that's probably not doable if you're a couple months behind. The payment plan has to be reasonable given your health and financial circumstances. So another way to say that is that the landlord has to try and work with you, think about what you can afford, and offer you a plan for any rent that's accumulated between now and early June. So if you find yourself in the position that you've lost income or maybe hours at work and you're not going to be able to pay some of the rent between now and early June, is to start thinking about what kind of plan can I afford, and do I think my landlord will work with me on that. In addition to stopping evictions that are based on rent and probably requiring landlords to work with renters who fall behind and come up with a payment plan, the moratorium also gives renters other protections, and I think they're all related to stopping landlords from trying to get around the law by using pressure tactics. And by that I mean your landlord can't raise your rent between now and June 4th. Your landlord can't take money out of your deposit if you've paid a security deposit to pay any rent that you haven't been able to pay. Your landlord can't increase your deposit or say you need to pay an extra, for example, $500. Your landlord can't move you to a smaller unit. So your landlord can't say, well, if you can't pay this month, I'm going to move you from your 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom. Landlord can't do that. Another thing a landlord can't do is if you have a month-to-month lease, so that's different than if you have a lease that goes for 12 months. If your lease is just month-to-month, the landlord can't end your month-to-month lease while the moratorium is in effect. So the soonest the landlord could do that under the moratorium would end your lease at the end of June at the very soonest. So I've been talking mostly about rent. Everything I've said also applies to utilities. Landlord can evict you if you don't pay the utilities. You might be wondering, well, that helps me with the landlord. What about my utility company? So far, there's no law that I can find that stops utility companies from shutting off your utilities. But every website I've seen from public and private utility companies around the Puget Sound area, they have said that they are not going to shut off people's utilities while the stay-at-home order is in effect, and they're doing what they can to work with their customers by setting up payment plans and even in some cases giving people subsidies. That means lowering your rates or helping you pay part of your bill. And I have a link where you can find some more information about the bigger private utility companies in the area. So that's the main point I have to make about the moratorium. There's more information about what I've just said at Washington Law Help, and I have a link for that in my slides. This link is specifically for protections for renters during the shutdown, but Washington Law Help is a great resource for easy to read information about all kinds of legal rights that you have. So I recommend that you check that out if you have more questions. I have links for more information about the CARES Act and national protections, more information about utilities. So I've just talked about the basics. If you got more questions and you want to inform yourself, you can check that out. All of these protections that I'm talking about have come from people organizing and advocating for our lawmakers to pass these protections. So I have a list of some organizations that have been doing that work in the past and are doing that work right now. If you want to get involved with that as renters, sharing your voice, sharing your story is a really effective way of supporting that change. And I think one of our speakers is from the Washington Long-Term Housing Alliance, so I'll let her talk more about that. And like I said at the beginning, there's free legal help available if, after my presentation, maybe after you visit one of the links and read a bit more about the law, you have questions about your situation. The best resource for free legal help at this point, if you think your landlord is ignoring the moratorium, is to call the Attorney General's office. And you can make a complaint online or you can call. I will send our host a form in Spanish that you can fill out. I don't know if the AG has it in Marshallese, but I'll check. But the AG, as far as I can tell, has been really active. If you send them a complaint, they will call you and they will call your landlord quickly. So it's a good resource. And if a landlord gets a call from the Attorney General's office, they're usually going to do what the Attorney General says. So it's a good resource. If you live in King County and you have questions about your rights as a renter, or you're worried your landlord's going to try to evict you, you can call or email my office. Our offices are closed, but we're still working from home and talking to people on the phone. And we'll be back open whenever things go back to somewhat normal. And if you live outside of King County, a great resource for free legal help is Northwest Justice Project's Clear Line. So I have their number and more information on their website. So just to wrap up, the takeaways that I hope everyone gets from this is that everyone in Washington is protected by the moratorium. And because of that moratorium, if you can't pay rent between now and June 4th, your landlord cannot give you an eviction notice, cannot start the eviction process, cannot try to evict you. If you have questions, there is free legal help in your community that's available to you. Reach out and get the help that you need to protect your rights. And then if you can, support efforts to strengthen these rights and expand these rights so that everyone in our community has more protections. And I will stick around if people have specific questions later on in the presentation. And with that, thanks for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to our host.
Thank you, Peter. That was awesome. A reminder that all of Peter's slides, we have provided a link in the chat box. You can click on the link to get to the slides. The chat box itself is downloadable. You go over to the little 3 dots on the far right of the chat box and click download to my computer, and you get to save these notes. Keep watching the notes. There's a lot of good information going by. We will be taking questions in a few minutes, but first I want to hear a little bit about the protections covering homeowners, which will be offered up by Joseph Jordan, managing attorney at Northwest Justice Project.
Thank you, Adair. Hello, everybody. My name is Joe. I am a managing attorney at Northwest Justice Project. I manage a unit here in King County that does all kinds of civil work. Thank you, Peter, for that presentation. Informative to me. I am looking forward to you answering the question of what is a reasonable payment plan here at the end of the presentation. I'm sure you're excited about defining that one for me. I don't have quite a rosy of an outlook as Peter does as it relates to residential mortgages throughout the country. There aren't these special programs, and there's not as many people gathering to help homeowners in throughout the nation. You know, last time we had a financial crisis, the second half of the financial crisis, there was a collective effort within the federal government to create certain programs that were going to be nationalized that helped a lot of people out. And I think I'm concerned that those same national programs are not going to be coming out on the other side of this current crisis. There has been a moratorium, might be the wrong word, but federally backed mortgages have been told by, or are telling their servicers to not proceed with foreclosure until May 17th. So proceeding with foreclosure, you know, in Washington state, that certainly means the filing and recording of a notice of trustee sale or conducting a sale, which is a good thing for homeowners. Those protections apply to, you know, 65% of the mortgages that are on the market. So you're talking your Fannie, your Freddie, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac loans, your loans that are like USDA residential mortgages, FHA mortgages, VA mortgages. So to figure out, you know, what kind of mortgage you want, you can, you know, Google Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loan lookup, and then that'll tell you whether or not the loan that you have is a Fannie or a Freddie loan, and you can see if you fall into that umbrella. If your loan is USDA, VA, FHA, I'm hoping you know that it is now, and if not, that's a little more complicated to figure out that it is. There are certain things that you can look at, but those loans are not supposed to be proceeding with foreclosure for 6 months, or excuse me, until May 17th. A lot of those programs, Fannie, Freddie, USDA, are telling their loan servicers to provide a 6-month forbearance plan. A 6-month forbearance plan basically means that you don't have to make payments for 6 months, and they won't put your loan into default. They won't charge you interest on the payments. They won't report it to the credit reporting agencies. And then at the end of the 6 months, nobody really knows what's going to happen. Traditionally, forbearances were a way to bridge somebody from a period of hardship, like they lost their job, experienced a medical hardship, had a divorce, and then ideally they would have recovered in 6 months and then would apply for a modification, meaning that most forbearance programs are such that you don't pay for 6 months, and then at the end of the 6 months, the loan servicer expects you to make the $18,000 in unpaid payments. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It hasn't made a lot of sense forever, but these are the forbearance programs that are available to borrowers under these programs right now. I mean, that's what the forbearance plans are. I mean, the language from Fannie and Freddie is that the loan servicers are going to work with you to make sure that you can stay in your home. Well, you know, that was the promise that they've been making since 2008. And I would tell you that working with you should be put in quotations, because it's very difficult to navigate the systems that they put in place for you to qualify for a modification or any other program. I think some of the industry people are trying to sell on people like me and the general public that there's going to be a program at the end where these unpaid payments of your 6 months or your 8 months are going to be tacked on to the end of the loan, and they're going to sit there quietly as you pay on your regular mortgage payment. That would be great, but I haven't seen anything in writing. I don't know that I'm going to see anything in writing. I think a lot of these programs, a lot of these loans are turned into investment products, and the investment products don't allow for those types of things. So then you're talking about getting all of these thousands of investors to agree to the changes in their security that they think that they invested in a long time ago. So it isn't going to be as easy as they say that it's going to be. I would like it, but my experience has been that, you know, that the large corporations are going to prioritize their shareholders before they're going to prioritize the homeowners. And so I think that would be the expectation. At least that's the expectation that I have. Not to be too cynical, something could change, but I'm thinking that at the end of this forbearance period that people are going to have to show that they're making sufficient income and get a modification of the mortgage, and that modification process is long and it's arduous and it's a pain in the side. If you're currently experiencing unemployment, or you're getting close to being unable to make your payment, or you know you're not going to be able to make your payment in May, then you need to call your servicer and talk about it now, and the loan servicer in almost all occasions is going to say, okay, we'll put you on a forbearance plan, especially if you call before your first missed payment. So, you know, you want to call before your first missed payment, you want to ask for that forbearance plan. Right now, the forbearance plans, everybody's putting them on 6-month forbearance plans. And then you can, some of them are saying you can ask for 6 months more. So that's 12 months of forbearance. You know, before the crisis, there was 0.25% of all loans were on a forbearance in the country. And now it's getting over 6% of loans are on a forbearance in the country. So the numbers are staggering right now. And I'm hoping it's not going to turn into a bloodbath like it did before, but I'm one of the vestiges of the foreclosure crisis and helped people through that period. And it was hard for a lot of people. In addition, you want to document your hardship. So if you lost your job or something happened, you were furloughed or whatever, you want to make sure that somehow you document that, keep letters from your employment. You know, that stuff's not hard. You just want to make it easier for you on the other side. And, you know, and I think that the loan servicers are going to be saying to a lot of people that it's all going to be peachy keen at the end. And I could be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong. And I'm hoping that programs are instituted that are going to help homeowners. They're not instituted yet. But the reason I bring that up is because if you're in the position, you know, and like Peter said, this is I don't apply to anybody's situation. It's just general advice. But when you're prioritizing at a certain point what debts you're going to be you're going to be paying, going into default on your mortgage is a very hard thing to come out of, at least in my experience. So I think a lot of, you know, like I said, a lot of loan services is going to tell you, get on a forbearance. It's all going to be easy in the end. And I don't know that it's all going to be easy in the end. And I'm concerned about that. So, you know, I guess the last thing, the one thing I missed is that that 70% of the loans, the federal loans that are on them, you know, they're not supposed to proceed with foreclosure till May 17th. There is no other restriction on the other 30% of the loans. So those loans can go to sale, they can go to provide any notices. There's no restriction on that 30% of the market. Right now, I don't think the trustees are conducting the sales because of the stay-at-home order. But once that stay-at-home order is lifted, then, you know, people are receiving notices of trustees sale as we speak. So if you receive one, then, you know, it can be happening. It can be happening legally as well. And that's about all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I actually think that your discussion is a great segue into the importance of advocacy right now because of the unknowns and the doable. We can't sit back right now. So I'd like to pass the mic to Michele Thomas from the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance. Why don't you tell us what your organization does and address some of these questions, especially that Joe has raised.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. Hello, everybody. Michele from the Housing Alliance. The Washington Low Income Housing Alliance and the Washington Housing Alliance Action Fund, our political sister organization, works to ensure that there is an opportunity for everyone in Washington to have a safe and affordable home. We're a statewide organization. We primarily work on state level policy. That's primarily what I will talk about today. We are a membership-based organization, and our movement is comprised of a wide variety of folks who care about ending homelessness and advancing opportunities for affordable housing. So that includes people who are renters, people experiencing housing insecurity, people experiencing homelessness, nonprofit landlords and affordable housing providers, direct service providers, folks who are advocates because they care about the issue, perhaps from a faith perspective or just from a social justice perspective. So our movement is comprised of a big group of folks, and that's why we're so powerful. We bring all these folks together. We create legislative priorities every year, and we bring them to our state capital, Olympia, to try to get as many protections passed and to get as much funding implemented for affordable housing and homelessness. We also elect housing champions. So we work to get housing champions to become lawmakers themselves. We educate them, and then once we have to elect them, we hold them accountable to the things that they've committed that they will do as an elected official. So I personally have been doing this work for a long time. I was a community organizer with the Tenants Union of Washington State and a volunteer with that organization. Over the time I was there, it was about 10 years. And then I started working on public policy while at the Tenants Union. And I've been doing public policy work for the Housing Alliance for about 11 years. So in all, I've been working on state level policy for over 13 years. And you know, just a silver lining, we're in a really dire, horrible, scary time, but our movement has never been stronger. We've not ever had more champions in the legislature. The last time we had such a significant economic downturn in Washington State during the Great Recession, we had a lot of lawmakers who did not, we didn't have nearly as many lawmakers, I should say, who were ready to stand up and fight against deep cuts to human services and deep cuts to affordable housing and homelessness programs. We just didn't have that level of energy and expertise within the legislature, but we do now. So there's going to be a lot of work to do in this budget climate to protect the wins that we have all made together over the past several years. But I feel like we're much, much better aligned than we ever have been to continue to advance protections and win good laws and funding, even in this really dire, scary time. And I know I can reflect on that because when I first started working on state level policy, Olympia, where state policy is passed, just looked really different. The movement to protect renters, homeowners, and to advance affordable housing and end homelessness has really grown significantly over the last several years. Partially that's because the crisis has worsened so significantly. The visibility of homelessness, of so many people struggling to survive the brutality of sleeping on the streets, is something that nobody can ignore. And that people can make their own choices about what that means to them. That can either be galvanizing and an opportunity to act and to say, no, this shouldn't be happening. And a lot of people have chosen that path. And this is not only true to our state, this is happening nationally as well. So even I think those of you who watched the Democratic presidential primary saw that for the first time, affordable housing and homelessness started coming up, not so much in the debates themselves, but in the plans that of the candidates. We saw for the first time real plans around how to advance affordable housing and how to end homelessness. We even saw a rent control plan by Bernie Sanders. I think that all speaks to how much this movement is growing and about how much the issue has become a central plank for elected officials. So in the state itself, over the past several years, we've actually had tremendous progress. I would say even over the last 3 years, we've been able to pass a lot of really significant protections, particularly around tenant protections and homelessness and affordable housing. The Foreclosure Fairness Act that we helped pass many years ago in Washington State to help homeowners is really significant. Obviously, as we heard, it's not enough to protect homeowners, but it was hard-fought policy that has created a much longer process and rights for homeowners along the way. So all of this is possible because of advocacy, as I think Peter mentioned. You know, if it wasn't for people speaking out and sharing their stories and educating lawmakers, if it wasn't for voters becoming informed about where their lawmakers stand and holding them accountable and asking them the questions, showing up at voters forums, making sure that they understand that tenant protections, homeowner protection, homelessness is something that we as voters want them to work on. If that wasn't happening, we wouldn't have seen the progress that we're seeing over the past several years. Still, despite all this progress, state legislative wins don't come easily. Particularly on tenant protections. Tenant protections are some of the hardest fought laws in Washington State. We push hard though every year. We did make advances last year, and that's despite the fact that there's many deep-pocketed landlord lobbyists in Olympia who do everything they can, oftentimes do everything they can. Sometimes they compromise, which is awesome. That's because lawmakers often force us all to the table to compromise. But they do create a significant opposition to our issues. And we do face conservative lawmakers who create obstacles. Despite that, though, like I said, key policies were passed in this very last legislative session that just ended in mid-March. Tenants now can request installment payment plans when you move in. So one of the biggest barriers the Housing Alliance was hearing to folks getting out of homelessness and to not end up in homelessness when they were forced to move is just the massive cost of moving into a new home. And so Representative Melanie Morgan sponsored a bill that we were able to help her pass that allows any tenant to request an installment move-in plan where you can pay your upfront costs, the deposits, and other expenses over a period of 3 months. There's some details there. So if that's something that you actually are facing yourself and need to know more about, you should contact us or Northwest Justice Project for more information. But we also passed a bill that allows tenants who rely on federal benefits as their main source of income to actually request a different rent due date. If their income doesn't come in on the first of every month, they can request a different due date that better aligns with when their income comes in. And that's significant. That's something that several years ago, there's no way we could have passed that in Washington State. And again, that's a result of our movement being stronger. Additionally, in this last legislative session, we were able to secure really significant budget appropriations for affordable housing and homelessness. I won't go into the weeds on the budget process, but this year was a secondary year to the budget making process. So typically you just won't see new money coming in. We saw significant money coming in for affordable housing and homelessness. And then most recently, and what Peter was talking about, the eviction moratorium that the governor just extended and deepened, that's a result of advocacy. That eviction moratorium is amazing. It is tremendous. It is probably, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but I think it's the best in the country. It's definitely the most thorough. And it's definitely a result of advocacy, seeing the ins and outs, the big sign-on letters, the lawmakers, the housing champions in the Senate and the House that worked to also help encourage the governor and his staff to pass it. All of this advocacy together resulted in that eviction moratorium that is going to significantly help folks and prevent homelessness from skyrocketing, at least until that moratorium is set to expire on June 4th. There may be a need to extend it, and there may be advocacy to extend it beyond June 4th. So definitely stay tuned for that. We really need to keep this movement going, though, because once that moratorium expires, we really will need a significant push for rental assistance, right? A moratorium is not forbearance. It's not rent relief. It's just an eviction moratorium for the time being. And so if you currently can't pay your rent, you will eventually have to pay your rent. And so we need significant funds. And unfortunately, part of the fallout from the COVID-19 stay-at-home orders and the impact on the economy is significant budget shortfalls for the state budget. Really, really, really significant budget shortfalls. So what that means is we need advocacy to prevent really, really deep cuts to affordable housing and homelessness and human services. Without that, we'll see what we saw back in the Great Recession, which was massive cuts to things like TANF and basic human services that we never, ever made up for. Every year, we made a little bit of progress, but we have never gotten back to the funding levels for key programs like TANF that were cut during the last Great Recession. So we really are going to need advocacy over the next year, probably 2 years, to prevent against deep cuts. We're going to need advocacy to, in the short term, either extend the eviction moratorium and to get rental assistance for the many, many people in Washington State who are going to need it, especially state-level rental assistance for undocumented households. So if we're able to secure federal assistance, hopefully, and we are pushing that federal dollars will not be limited by immigration status, but just in case, if it is, we really need the state government, despite this bleak budget outlook, to appropriate some level of money that will be specifically geared towards immigrant households so that their needs can be met as well. And so I think that we have a federal action alert, that was put into the chat. Thank you. So I really encourage everybody to take action on that. So that's a request to our federal delegation, so our lawmakers who spend a lot of their time in DC, to take federal dollars and appropriate them for Washington State. The amount of money we need for rental assistance and for homelessness prevention and for affordable housing is so great, especially because of this bleak budget environment we're facing in Washington, that we desperately need the federal government to step in. There is an opportunity that they'll do a fifth federal CARES Act. They just did a fourth one the other day. We're hoping that they'll do a fifth one soon, maybe as early as May 4th, and that will include significant dollars for housing and homelessness. So that federal action that's in the chat box is really important. There are Democrats pushing hard for it, but unfortunately there's a fair amount of conservatives in DC who are saying that it's not needed, that unemployment insurance should be enough, and that's met all the needs in the country. And I think we all know that that's far from true. So thank you for taking action. Thank you for all you do. And with that, I'll pass it on. Thanks for having me on tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Michelle. That's incredibly important information to flesh out. We've gone from the what can I do this moment to deal with my family's economic crisis in this moment, and looking forward to what can we do to protect in the longer run. We have time for just a few questions tonight. I don't know if people have filed some. If David, have you collected questions from our audience?
So far, we just have one that hasn't been answered. You all have done such a great job of explaining things. This question is any work being done to limit or block landlords from charging for credit checks?
Does anybody know that answer to that question?
I can partly answer the question. So I think there was some work done on this issue at the state level maybe a couple of years ago, and the result was that renters, when they're applying for an apartment, can buy a background check that includes a credit check and other information like your rental history, and then you can reuse that background check when you're in the market for housing. I think the problem with that law is that it's not mandatory, so landlords can choose to accept them, but a lot of them don't because they want to charge for the credit check. I don't know if, Michelle, if you know if there's work going on that issue, or Joe, if either of you know if there's more recent work going on that issue.
Yeah, this is Michelle. So we did work, as you said, a lot on tenant screening and trying to lower the cost, and that is still something that needs to be addressed. The cost of tenant screening is arbitrary. Technically they can't charge more than the real cost of it, but it can be quite expensive. And it is a cost of business that the landlords pass straight on to the tenant. And unfortunately, the installment payment plan bill doesn't include the cost of the tenant screening reports because it comes before you're actually a tenant. It comes at the application. So no, and the moratorium also does not apply to this either. So you raise a really important issue that is still can be a very significant barrier to housing for folks, especially if they're charging a separate credit check fee or a tenant screening report for every tenant in the household, for every adult rather in the household. I will say that some rental assistance programs, though, and direct service providers are able to help cover those costs.
I have a really nuts and bolts question, I think, for Peter. If you are a renter and you are unable to pay right now, is there a deadline by which you have to start the negotiations with your landlord?
No, there's no deadline. I invite the other speakers to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's anything in Governor Inslee's law that has a deadline for when you have to start negotiations. And I think there's different ways that if you're a renter and you owe some rent already, or you think you're not going to be able to pay May's rent on time, depending on what your sense is of how flexible your landlord is, what your relationship with your landlord is, you could approach your landlord sooner than later and see if you can come to some kind of a payment plan that will work for both of you. You can ask for something like Joe was talking about, forbearance. So that's taking the rent, for example, that's due next month and paying it later. Hopefully when you have some more money coming in and paying that on installments. Anecdotally, just talking to renters as part of my work, a lot of landlords are doing that. Some landlords are even waiving rent. So you could, if you can pay something, you can approach your landlord and say, hey, I can pay 2/3 of May's rent if you cancel the rest. Some landlords might say, no way. But I heard of other landlords saying, yeah, I'd rather get some money coming in than nothing. I'll agree to that. Or you could wait and see what happens. Maybe you're really unsure about what your income is going to be in the near future. I think another reasonable strategy is waiting until June 4th and waiting for your landlord to get in touch with you. I guess the other point I'll add is if you come to any kind of agreement with your landlord, get it in writing so that your landlord doesn't turn around sometime in the future and say, I changed my mind that I was going to give you that installment plan. Having something in writing is helpful to protect you from that happening. And even something, a signed contract is best, but even just having some emails that explains what the agreement is it can be helpful.
And
Yeah,
we,
all this
the labor movement,
Michelle.
I was going to say, the labor movement talk a lot about deadlines. We pay a lot of attention to deadlines in our contracts when we're enforcing our rights. It seems like I wouldn't want to wait until June 4th because wouldn't I want to make a move before June 4th? Just curious.
Well, this is Michelle. It's actually the landlord that's supposed to offer the payment plan. And it's the only way that they can evict you if there's non-payment of rent after the moratorium. And so they don't have the right to collect your debt that was unpaid during the time it accrues during the moratorium unless they've offered a payment plan. So most landlords probably will somehow get a wind of this and try to negotiate a payment plan with the tenants. But the Attorney General's office was on the Housing Alliance's weekly COVID calls yesterday. And the Attorney General said, you really don't have to accept a payment plan that doesn't work for you. You have the right to negotiate a personalized payment plan that is reasonable, and the moratorium has the term reasonable in it. And so it's an odd scenario where they've given a lot of power to tenants to negotiate something that works for them, and that's not really typical in the way the power dynamics typically work. So we just really encourage folks to not get into a situation where you sign something that you know that you can't afford, but to just show that you're actively negotiating to try to reach a reasonable plan that's based on your personal circumstances.
That's incredibly helpful.
I have a question about for the homeowners. You know, one of the biggest lenders around here are big credit unions like BECU. Are those federal or are those not covered? Are those in the 30% that aren't covered by the?
It depends. You know, BECU has some portfolio loans is what we call them. That means that they actually own the loan. And if it's a portfolio loan, then it would not be covered by the federal moratorium. I also know that they service Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac loans as well. So they do a bit of both. That's just BECU. Some of the other credit unions, you know, it's not, the general practice is normally, you know, to originate these loans in a way that you can sell them to Fannie or Freddie Mae so that you end up just servicing them as opposed to having the risk associated with the mortgage. So I would, yeah, I mean, it would sort of depend, but I think that my point is that the credit unions probably don't have that many portfolio loans that fit in that area. It's really some of the small loan servicers that are out there that are, you know, like Ocwen, and they're changing all the time. Select Portfolio Services. It's, you know, they're always, and they're not banks. They're just loan servicers, and they're the ones that service on behalf of a lot of these securitized trusts. So
Okay.
That's where you get into an area where the sale or the foreclosure proceeding is not restricted.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I am mindful of our time, and it's about time to wrap. I guess I would ask each of our 3 guest speakers if there's anything you'd like to add as a closing brief comment.
All right, I'll start, Peter. You know, right now there's not a lot of hope out there. I mean, not a lot of help out there for homeowners, but I think that there is some momentum to try to get more in Washington State. There's been some services provided on the links on the right side of the page here that, you know, people have a right to a housing counselor. You can get a housing counselor for free in Washington State. So if you're having issues with your mortgage, call the phone numbers, try to get help here in Washington State. In addition, obviously, to calling your servicer and getting the forbearance plan.
Great. Peter?
I guess I'll just reiterate that if you have questions about your rights, or you're having a problem with your landlord, or you want to know more about how should I talk to my landlord about a payment plan, you don't have to do this on your own. There's help available from renters, from the Attorney General's office, from my office. So I'd encourage you to connect with those resources. You don't have to do this on your own. And I'd also just reiterate that as a renter, sharing your stories about what you're dealing with, what you want to see, is a really powerful tool to keep this movement going forward.
Thank you for that. Michele?
Yeah, I'll just second what Peter said. Thank you, Peter, for calling out the need for stories. That's so important. And just don't forget to take action. There was a question I think Rachel had about how likely is it we're going to see evictions in 6 to 12 months. I think the only way we're going to prevent a lot of people losing their homes is if we get this federal funding in for rental assistance. So please do join us in taking action. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. These are really unprecedented times. You know, the wheels have come off the bus that was already broken and shaky and rattling its way into the pit stop. The wheels are off the bus. This is a time for people to educate themselves and to take the action necessary to protect themselves and their families and their communities. If you are a steward of a local union, you know how important it is to educate yourself about legal issues and then to help others around you know their rights and exercise their rights. And we hope that every union steward, every union activist, and every community activist will take this information out to others. Stay in touch with the organizations you've heard from tonight. Their links are in the chat. Again, if you go to the 3 little dots in the chat room off to the side of the page, you have a chance to download everything that's in the chat. We will also send all of this information out in a follow-up email to everyone who has participated tonight. You will also be able to look at and download the videotape of this webinar in a day or 2 after it's posted up. We have 3 more meetings in this series on workers' rights in the COVID era coming up over the series of next 3 Thursday nights. We have coming up next week, we address health insurance for those who are finding themselves unemployed and suddenly without their workplace-based health insurance. What can I do? For everyone right now who does not have health insurance, this is a terrifying moment. There are solutions. We will have experts come and talk about state resources. Following that, by popular demand, we're going to circle back and have an updated conversation about unemployment in Washington State, Thursday, May 7th. how to apply for unemployment under the new federal guidelines, under the old state guidelines, under the emergency state guidelines. There are many, many options. We want to make sure everybody who is eligible has a chance to apply and receive the benefits to which they are entitled. Following that, on Thursday, May 14th, we will be discussing opportunities for worker training and retraining. Some of us may find ourselves out of work or in an industry that no longer feels viable. There are incredible opportunities opening up, and we hope to make sure everybody leaves understanding what they are and how to access them. I want to thank our speakers again. I want to thank our sponsors again. I want to thank our interpreters. Thank you very much to the interpreters. Send your friends to our follow-up meetings. And thank you all for participating tonight. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.